a silence that lives inside glass, not the silence of emptiness, but the stillness of something that once held light, and now remembers how it broke. My name is Clara, and I sculpt glass not to make it perfect, but to let it fracture where it needs to. I don't fix what's broken, I hold it, turn it gently in my hands, and wait for the light to come through. The people who visit my studio always speak of beauty, of precision, of reflections, but they never ask what I see when I press my forehead to the cold, curved edge of a half-melted mirror. They don't hear the melody I hum without knowing why, and they don't see the woman in my dreams. She has long hair and eyes that carry a sadness too quiet to name, and a voice I've never heard, only felt. Like the way memory wraps itself around you when no one's looking. She stands in a garden of climbing roses, always out of reach, always waiting. I never wake afraid, only hollow, as if something forgot to come back with me. My family would tell you I am deeply loved, and they would not be lying. My mother, Martha, soft-spoken, warm, with hands that always smelled faintly of cinnamon and old paper, listens carefully, smiles gently, but closes every conversation just before it becomes real. My father, Henry, is the kind of man who still believes in handwritten letters and Sunday breakfasts. He laughs often and believes too much in hope. And then there's Leo, my brother by name, my shadow in every childhood memory. We were never apart, not even in silence. And if pain was a room, Leo always stood beside me in it, holding the door open, waiting for me to walk out first. So why, in a house so full, have I always felt like I'm echoing inside walls that don't belong to me? Why do I carve patterns into glass that never finish? Why do I leave cracks, deliberate and precise? In every piece I sign my name to, they call it artistry. And they say it's a signature, but I think it's a confession. I was sculpting a prism the day the air shifted, not in sound, not in scent, but in something older, something that lives in bone. The melody I always hum played louder in my chest than usual, and when I looked up, my mother stood in the doorway, not speaking, just watching me through the mirror of a half-finished panel. The reflection split her face, one half soft and proud, the other dimmed by something ancient and unspoken. She turned away before I could ask what she was seeing. That night, I dreamt of the woman again, but this time, she stepped closer and I could almost touch her. The roses brushed her wrists, her lips moved, and though I heard nothing, I felt the words fall inside me like shards of a story I had always carried but never heard. I woke before dawn, the melody still on my tongue, and the silence in my room no longer felt hollow. It felt like it was waiting for a truth that was already inside the glass, just beneath the fractures I never dared to trace. There are moments that do not crash into you like thunder but press in slowly, like water rising beneath a closed door, quiet, steady, and irreversible. The morning my father collapsed. There were no screams, no shattered plates, only the sound of something fragile being dropped just out of sight. I had been in the kitchen, my hands rinsing a piece of glass still warm from the kiln, when I heard my mother call his name, once, then again, softer. That softness terrified me more than any cry for help, because it was the sound of someone already trying to accept what had just begun. The hospital air had that sterile quiet, the kind that muffles not only voices but hope itself. I watched as monitors blinked without urgency, as if unaware of the man lying beneath them, a man who once fixed every hinge in our home by hand, who believed that things stayed together simply because you cared enough not to let them fall apart. But this was different. His liver, they said, was failing. The damage had advanced quietly, like ivy climbing the inside walls of his body, hidden until it bloomed in collapse. I remember Leo standing next to me, gripping a clipboard of consent forms, his thumb tapping a corner like he was trying to wake himself from a dream. Martha sat folded into herself, her gaze anchored not to the room, not to her husband, but to something far behind her eyes. It wasn't denial she wore like a veil that day. It was memory, ancient and unspoken. And I didn't know yet how dangerous that could become. The doctor's voice, calm and practiced, explained possibilities that felt more like negotiations with fate. We needed a liver donor, and the match had to be exact, with margins for success narrow. And time, he reminded us, not a kindness we could count on. He suggested extended genetic testing, not only within our immediate family, but across registered banks, with hopes that a genetic match might exist among distant relatives. A broader net, he called it. A broader net to catch a sliver of light before it vanished beneath the tide. We all agreed. Of course. And Leo nodded first while I signed without hesitation. My mother hesitated, not long enough to draw attention, but just enough for me to notice the way her hand paused, the way her pen hovered as if tracing not her signature, but the outline of a memory she had never spoken aloud. She signed in the end, and I felt something invisible shift. Not in the room, but inside her. As though a door long sealed had creaked open a breath. The days that followed blurred at the edges, like light refracted through a cracked lens. I moved through them. Appointments, blood draws, whispered reassurances, all wrapped in the hush of a family trying not to break louder than the illness already had. At night, I caught my mother sorting through old boxes, her fingers brushing across photo albums and envelopes sealed long ago. When I asked if she was looking for something, she smiled and told me it was nothing, then closed the lid a little too quickly, as though afraid the silence might speak. One afternoon, while searching for Henry's insurance records, I stumbled across a thin folder tucked behind books in his study, yellowed at the edges, brittle with time. Inside was a newspaper clipping, barely legible, a car accident, 30 years ago, involving a woman named Diana who had died on impact, and an infant who had survived. There were no additional names, no follow-up story, no photos, only a headline. And beneath it, something that felt like a breath held too long, finally exhaled. I didn't tell anyone. Not right away, because I wasn't sure what it meant. I folded the article back into the folder and placed it where I'd found it, but I carried it with me, not the paper, but the feeling it left in my chest, like a chord struck in a melody I didn't know I knew. And each night, the woman in my dreams stood a little closer, the roses around her blooming brighter, her gaze quieter, not haunting, but expectant, like someone who knows she is about to be remembered, like a name whispered through glass, waiting to be called aloud, like someone who knows she is about to be remembered, like a name whispered through glass, waiting to be called aloud. Waiting becomes its own kind of storm, not loud or visible, but aching in the bones. Coiled behind the ribs like a tide you pretend you don't feel rising. The results were supposed to arrive midweek, yet every day bled into the next with the heavy silence of a breath held too long. My hands still moved, slicing, polishing, shaping, but my mind stayed elsewhere, circling shadows I couldn't name. I found myself pausing mid-stroke, the grinding wheel still spinning, as if expecting the mirror to speak first. Martha changed in quiet increments, subtle, but visible if you knew what her stillness used to mean. She no longer folded the laundry in the living room where the sunlight landed, but instead retreated to corners of the house where the windows remained closed. At night, I'd hear her footsteps stop outside my door. lingering for a second longer than necessary, like someone trying to remember if they'd forgotten to lock something. When she smiled, it didn't reach her eyes, and when she looked at me, I could feel her seeing not just the present, but a memory trying to resurface. Leo began to ask questions he hadn't before, not about my art, but about my dreams. One evening, he sat with me in the studio, watching me sketch without speaking, until the silence itself grew too heavy to carry alone. "The woman," he said finally. "The one in your dreams. Does she ever say anything?" His voice didn't demand an answer. It was a thread he handed to me, gently, in case I was ready to pull. I shook my head slowly, but my hands betrayed me, pressing harder into the charcoal, leaving marks I hadn't intended and couldn't explain. One evening, while gathering paperwork for the insurance liaison, I pulled out a drawer too far and spilled its contents across the floor. Receipts, appointment slips, and beneath them, a brittle newspaper fragment I didn't recognize. I knew it was the same clipping from before, yet I hadn't placed it there, which meant either someone else had, or it had found me on its own. I stared at Diana's name, blurred but legible, and felt a strange echo inside my chest. Not fear, not recognition, but the hush that follows when someone calls your name in a dream. I took the clipping to Leo that night, saying very little, because there was nothing certain yet to say. He read it slowly, twice, before lifting his eyes to mine, and there was no shock in his expression, only the slow unfurling of a knowing he had carried too long without shape. "Diana," he murmured, like it was a note from a song he couldn't place, then added softly, "That's Mom's sister's name, isn't it?" His words landed like dust on glass, almost invisible, but once noticed, they changed everything. The next morning, I found Martha in the living room, surrounded by open boxes. She was holding a photograph I'd never seen, a younger version of her, standing beside a woman who looked just like me, but with eyes too sad for someone so young. I didn't speak, and she didn't flinch. She looked up slowly and said, "That's Diana," as if I'd already known, as if the dream had already told me. Then she tucked the photo away, gently, and rose without finishing whatever story had just begun, leaving it floating between us like breath on cold glass. Later that day, as I stood in the studio, I noticed a thin crack snaking across one of my finished pieces, a sculpture I had completed days earlier, whole when I signed it, now bearing a fracture I hadn't placed. I traced it with my fingertip, not to erase, but to understand, because there was no shatter, just a line, clean, quiet, and undeniable. The glass had spoken, and it knew before I did. The day we returned to the testing center, everything felt unnaturally composed, as if the walls had been instructed to stay still, and the air itself was holding breath. Leo drove us in silence, the kind that feels deliberate, like a truce between two thoughts that hadn't yet learned how to share space. I watched the sky blur behind tinted windows, and every mile felt like a descent into something we couldn't undo. There was no music, no hum of traffic to ground us, only the soft rhythm of tires tracing lines we didn't choose. Heading toward answers we hadn't asked for with enough clarity to be ready. The waiting room was beige. That particular shade meant to comfort, but only succeeded in making time slow to a crawl. A nurse called our names gently, almost apologetically, as if the results had a weight she didn't want to carry alone. The consultation room was brighter than I expected, sterile and open, with a single monitor glowing in the corner like a quiet eye that had already seen too much. The technician greeted us with a practiced kindness, the kind you learn when you've watched too many people realize their lives are no longer what they thought they were. He smiled, sat down, and began with the good news. A match had been found, a viable donor, distant in relation, but genetically compatible with Henry's profile. Relief flickered across Leo's face like light through a ripple, and I nodded slowly, though my body didn't release anything it had been holding. The technician's hand hovered over the keyboard for a moment longer than necessary. Then he cleared his throat, adjusted the screen, and began to explain the mapping of family traits, the markers we shared, the ones we didn't, and the anomalies that had quietly waited beneath our names. His voice softened at the word anomaly, and he hesitated just slightly, his eyes flicking toward me for a second, too quick for alarm, but too focused to dismiss. In reviewing the extended genetic markers, he said slowly, "We found a discrepancy in the expected parentage alignment. Specifically, Clara, your profile does not align biologically with Mr. Henry." The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was thick, tense, expectant. "Nor with Mrs. Martha," he added, after a beat that fell like a floor collapsing quietly beneath our feet. The monitor shifted to a new display, a branching diagram, full of names and connections, most of them unfamiliar, until he pointed to one, Diana. Her name flickered on the screen, like a breath caught mid-sentence, almost unwilling to settle. "Clara, your genetic markers match directly with this individual. Diana, surname redacted, who appears to have been the sister of Mrs. Martha." He didn't look at me when he said it. No one did, not even Leo, who had always been the one to meet my eyes first. The silence after was not empty. It was crowded with everything we'd believed, now hovering like glass suspended mid-shatter. I couldn't speak because my pulse had migrated to my throat. My hands, the soles of my feet, pounding louder than any thought. My brother, who had stood beside me in every room of our lives, reached for my hand with the same instinct as always, but this time, his grip trembled. And though we were still siblings in gesture, it felt as if our names had begun to dissolve. I heard myself asking, "Are you sure?" though the answer had already arrived, embedded in the technician's silence, in Leo's eyes, in the way the word Diana refused to leave the screen even as the others faded. The technician only nodded, slowly, deliberately. "This happens sometimes," he murmured, as if he were explaining a geological fault line, not a family, not a name, not a life. I left the room without hearing the rest. My body moved forward, but I was no longer fully inside it. The hallway lights fractured in my vision, and the glass doors at the end of the corridor gleamed like mirrors, not reflecting, but revealing versions of myself I had never met. In the distance, I could hear the technician's voice continuing, calmly cataloging the rest of our genetics. But to me, it sounded like a foreign language spoken through water and memory. Behind the mirror, the story had shifted, and I was no longer who I thought I was. We did not speak in the car, not because we were angry, or afraid, or even confused, but because there was no language left for what we had just learned. The silence between me and Leo was not a wound, but a mirror, and neither of us was ready to look directly into it. The city moved past us, unaware and uncaring. The world still spinning in the rhythm of errands and headlines while something inside me had stopped, or perhaps shifted, and would never quite fit back the same way again. The house was too quiet when we returned, like it had heard the news before we had. Martha was in the kitchen, hands folded around a cooling mug, her eyes fixed on something outside the window that wasn't there. She didn't turn when we entered, and she didn't ask. She simply waited, as if she'd known this moment would come for 30 years and had prepared to greet it with the quiet resignation of someone who had already mourned what would be lost. I laid the printed results on the counter between us. No accusations, no demands, only a sheet of paper and the weight it carried, heavier than any word I could summon. Henry walked in moments later, his breath catching before he even saw what it was. He looked at Leo first, then me, and when his eyes dropped to the page, I saw something in his face falter, not the look of a man caught in a lie, but of someone who had hoped the truth might stay buried beneath the surface forever. They didn't deny it. There was no dramatic reveal and no desperate justifications. Only the quiet unraveling of a secret long held and the fragile grace with which they tried to offer it back to me. Martha spoke first, her voice not breaking but bending. She told us about Diana, about her wildness, her dreams, her gentleness and recklessness, and how she had died before anyone had a chance to understand her fully. Diana had fallen in love with a man the family refused to speak of, someone whose name was never written, whose absence lingered louder than his presence ever could. Their love had been brief, but consuming. And Clara had been born from that fire, only for it to be extinguished by a crash on a rainy road when Diana was driving her newborn home from a visit to the sea. She spoke of the baby left behind, the call no one wanted to make, and the promise she and Henry made to protect that child from a world too eager to judge what it could not explain. I listened not as a daughter betrayed, but as a stranger being handed the remnants of a story she should have known all along. Leo sat beside me, silent but steady, his hand grazing my shoulder once, just enough to say that while the frame had changed, the picture remained. Henry, dear. Steady Henry said only this: we never lied out of shame. We lied out of love. It should have hurt more. It should have shattered something deep inside me. But all I felt was tired, not from anger, but from the weight of carrying a version of myself that had never belonged. The questions came later, like tremors after the quake. Why didn't they tell me sooner? Did Diana ever hold me? What was lost in the space between silence and protection? That night, I stood in my studio long after the lights had gone out, the outlines of glass sculptures casting soft shadows across the walls. I ran my fingers along the edge of a piece I'd once thought perfect, now realizing it had always been slightly uneven, beautiful, but off balance. Like me. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't in pain, but because there was no breaking left to do. In that stillness, I began to understand the truth had not destroyed me, only revealed where I had already been fractured. The surgery happened under a sky the color of milk glass, dim and opaque, as if the world itself was bracing for something it could not predict. I didn't wait at the hospital, not because I didn't care, but because I needed silence, a space without questions, a room where my breath could find itself again. Leo stayed behind, texting updates that I read without responding, my fingers hovering above keys, never pressing send. I returned to my studio, though I wasn't ready to create, just to be near something that knew how to break and still hold light. The furnace was off, the room chilled and silent, with glass pieces lined like memories along the walls. I sat on the floor with my knees drawn to my chest, surrounded by sculptures that bore my name, though I now questioned who had signed them. The woman who made them had lived under a name borrowed from love and silence, and now she stood alone in the wreckage of both. I touched one piece, a prism I had fused months ago, and tilted it toward the ceiling. The light that passed through it bent gently, as if trying to say that even distortion can be beautiful if you stop expecting clarity. My father survived the operation, and the transplant was successful. When I finally returned to the hospital, he was asleep, pale but steady, and Leo greeted me with a nod that carried too many things to name. Later, When my father opened his eyes, he didn't speak at first, only looked at me with a kind of quiet permission, like he knew I could leave at any moment, but hoped I would choose not to. He didn't apologize directly. Instead, he whispered, "You've always been mine. I just didn't know how to hold the truth without risking losing you." And somehow, that was enough, not to erase, but to soften. At home, the air was thick with what had not been said. Martha moved through rooms with the grace of someone tiptoeing across thin ice, careful not to break what remained. I didn't resent her fully. I resented the silence she had been forced to live in, the weight of protection turned into concealment. At dinner, no one mentioned Diana by name, but I could feel her sitting with us, not as a ghost, but as a thread now woven visibly into the fabric of who we were becoming. I began to return to the studio late at night, not to finish anything specific, but to begin again. I took pieces I had once discarded, flawed, uneven, uncentered, and started to arrange them anew, not as fragments to be fixed, but as truths to be revealed. Some cracked edges I wrapped in gold leaf. Others I left raw and untouched, letting them speak of what they had endured in silence. It wasn't about repair anymore. It was about light, and what passes through the cracks when nothing is forced to hide. Leo remained the bridge, never demanding, never instructing, just there. In small things, a cup of tea left at my door, a shared silence on the back steps, a comment like, "You still hum that tune," said not to analyze but to remind me that even melody has memory. I asked him once if he still thought of me the same way he always had. He looked at me, steady and calm, and said, "I think of you the only way I ever have. You're my sister." No amount of truth could undo that. And maybe he was right, not because it was simple, but because it had always been true. Maybe family isn't defined by who stood at the beginning, but who remains when the light shifts, and in the stillness between fractures. I began to build something stronger than glass. The box was smaller than I remembered, tucked behind other forgotten things in the back of my mother's closet. Wrapped in a scarf I had seen once in an old photograph, but never in life. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I carried it to the studio like one might carry a fragile truth, close to the chest, unsure if it would crack under light. For a while, I just sat there, the box on my lap, my fingers brushing the silk folds, knowing the moment I opened it, some part of silence would end. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for the weight of a voice that had never spoken to me but had always been there, humming beneath everything. Inside, there wasn't much. A few photographs, a ticket stub yellowed with time, and a note, folded so carefully it seemed sacred. But it was the necklace that made my breath catch. Delicate, silver, with a tiny glass pendant, slightly cracked, holding a fleck of blue inside like a trapped sky. I had never seen it before, yet somehow I knew it belonged to Diana, and somehow I knew it was meant for me. The note confirmed it, a scrap of handwriting I had never read but recognized in my bones, as if the loops and slants carried echoes through blood, a kind of language only lineage understands. She had written not to explain, but to leave a trace, a small constellation of thought. The melody I always hummed was there in her words, described as a tune she used to sing while painting, one she never remembered learning but always returned to. There was a line, "If she ever hums this, tell her it was mine, and it is now hers." And I realized that the song wasn't passed down like a story, but lived in me like a memory misplaced. Not haunting, but familiar. I wasn't haunted. I was inhabited by something ancient and kind. I sat with her words for hours, letting them undo me gently. It wasn't grief. Not exactly. More like recognition. The kind that doesn't demand tears but invites stillness. Martha found me there as the light dipped low, casting long amber bars across the concrete floor. She didn't ask to read the letter. She didn't reach for the necklace. She only sat down beside me, her hands folded in her lap, her silence no longer protective, but present and real. Then, in a voice softened by dusk and time, she spoke, not in explanation, but in remembrance. She said Diana used to hum to the roses as she painted them in the garden, that her laughter was like wind in a silk curtain, sudden and then gone. She recalled how Diana once danced barefoot in a thunderstorm, eyes closed, arms outstretched, saying the sky didn't frighten her. It reminded her to feel. And she told me that the pendant had always been Diana's favorite, worn not for fashion, but for something unspoken, as if she believed it held the light of a memory too fragile to name. For the first time, I didn't need her to explain. I just needed her to breathe next to me without answers. Later that night, I took the pendant and placed it on my workbench, not as an heirloom, but as material ready to transform. I began crafting something new, not to preserve her, but to carry her forward with light and memory. The glass I chose was imperfect, touched by air bubbles and uneven seams, but I didn't cut them out or smooth them over. I worked with them, letting their irregularities guide the shape. Around the fleck of sky, I shaped petals, not identical, but leaning together, like sisters who had never met but understood each other across time and silence. There was no letter I could send her, no words that would arrive, no envelope that could carry what I meant. But I spoke anyway, not aloud, but in the rhythm of heat and hands, of glass melting and reforming beneath my steady breath. And as the kiln cooled, I felt her closer, not as a ghost, but as a guide, born from within. I didn't need to know everything about her. I just needed to remember that she had lived, that she had loved, that she had left something behind for me to find. And in the glow of forgotten fire, I found her voice inside my own, not as a whisper, but as a song I had always known without realizing. There are silences that feel like a wound, and others that arrive like shelter, the kind built not to hide, but to hold. In the slow days that followed, my father began to move again, first in fragments, a blink, a breath, a soft motion of the hand, and then more wholly, like a man returning not just to life, but to the weight of his choices. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were fewer than his eyes, and his eyes seemed to have aged in a way that no mirror could reflect. One morning, as the light sifted through the curtain like sifted sugar, he asked me if I wanted to walk with him in the garden, and somehow, that single question held everything he couldn't say aloud. We walked in silence, the kind shaped by mutual knowing rather than absence. He paused by the climbing roses, the same place I had seen in dreams, though in daylight they looked less like memory and more like forgiveness. He bent slightly to touch a petal and said, "She used to love these," his voice not breaking, but bent with memory. A sentence stretched across decades of quiet love. I didn't need to ask who he meant because I already knew, and when he turned to me, something in his gaze folded, not in regret, but in the offering of space I could step into, or not, entirely mine to choose. Later, he told me, over tea cooling between us, that love had never been the absence of fear, but the choice to stay anyway. He said he had stayed, with Martha, with me, not because the lie was easy, but because the truth had felt too large to carry without shattering everything in its path. And then he added, softly, "But you deserve the truth. You always did." His hands shook slightly as he lifted the cup, and I realized that his trembling wasn't weakness, but release. The letting go of decades of silence, handed over like a heavy coat no longer needed and finally laid down. That evening, I returned to the studio, not to escape, but to listen, not to voices, but to what remained after they'd fallen quiet. The kind of silence that outlines presence rather than absence. I placed the nearly finished sculpture beneath the lamplight and traced the edges of each petal, each imperfection, as if reading a letter written in texture instead of ink, a kind of tactile truth. Leo stopped by, said nothing at first, only watched the light bend and refract through the glass, then eventually spoke in a voice low and certain. She would have been proud. I nodded, knowing he meant Diana, but also Martha, maybe even all three of us in our own incomplete way. I started sleeping with the window open, letting the wind bring in sounds that didn't need explanation, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of passing cars, the rhythm of something vast continuing without permission, yet not without witness. And in that surrender, I stopped trying to resolve everything. Some truths don't conclude, they accompany. Some wounds don't close, they flow into light. And their presence becomes a quiet clarity that asks for nothing but acknowledgement. I began to understand that clarity wasn't always brightness. Sometimes, it was simply the ability to see beauty in a pattern you didn't choose. In a quiet hour near dawn, I found myself writing again, not a letter, not even a journal entry, but fragments. Words like forgive, remain, belong, and enough emerged without command. Like shells left by a receding tide after a storm not meant to destroy, but to reveal. They weren't answers. They were evidence that I had felt, that I had heard, that I had stayed, and that staying itself was an act of meaning. And in that staying, I saw myself, not as a daughter lost, but as a woman returned, not to a place, but to a tender recognition that love, in its quietest form, always finds a way to speak. Some homes are rebuilt not with timber or nails, but with the quiet gestures that follow understanding, the way a hand lingers longer, the way silence feels less like withdrawal and more like space offered to breathe. We didn't speak of the fracture often, not because it no longer mattered, but because the echo had softened, and what replaced it wasn't erasure but resonance. In the living room, a framed photo of Diana now rested beside those of birthdays and graduations. Not hidden, not exalted, but present. Like the sound of a name once whispered, now spoken aloud with gentle certainty. My father began spending more time in the garden again. I'd find him bent over the soil, not as a retreat, but as a return, hands in earth that forgave everything, tending roots without needing to name them or explain their shape. Martha, quieter than before, moved through rooms as if relearning the feel of floorboards beneath her feet, allowing herself to inhabit the house as someone who no longer needed to protect its truths with silence or shadow. Even Leo lingered longer at the threshold, staying past dinner, his voice softer when he spoke of work or asked how my latest sculpture was coming along. A question less about art than about how I was holding myself together. There was no grand reconciliation, no scene to declare that we had healed, only a slow settling, like dust deciding where to land without fanfare or force. Sometimes I'd sit with Martha and ask more about Diana, not out of grief, but curiosity, the kind that seeks not to reopen wounds, but to trace where the light enters them and where memory begins to soften into presence. She told me stories that made Diana feel like a person rather than a portrait. How she once dyed her hair blue on a dare. How she argued fiercely but loved gently. How music wasn't just sound to her, but a pulse through which she moved. And when Martha said, she didn't just fall in love, she believed in it, even when it didn't believe in her. I felt the echo of that belief reverberate through my own chest like a second heartbeat. Diana had loved a man the family disapproved of. Someone whose presence felt like fire in winter, dangerous but impossible to turn away from. A warmth that came with risk. Clara, she said, had been born not out of mistake, but out of devotion. A choice Diana made with her whole being, not blindly, but bravely. We placed a small shelf in the hallway near the window, a space for her. Not a shrine, but a continuation of breath. On it lay a sketchbook, a dried rose, and the pendant I still sometimes wore, not for remembrance, but for alignment with a past that shaped me without asking. Passing it each morning, I didn't feel haunted. I felt held, as if every object knew where it belonged. At night, I dreamed less of questions and more of landscapes, open roads, oceans without horizon, glass that caught starlight instead of shattering it into silence. Something had changed, not just in my name, but in how I carried it, not as a burden, but as a bridge. I stopped looking for completeness and started recognizing the grace of becoming something honest. Family wasn't a linear map, it was a constellation, drawn not by blood, but by choice, memory, and the courage to stay. We were not mended, we were mosaicked. And in that mosaic, there was no piece out of place. And I was no longer trying to rebuild what was. I was living inside what is, and letting it become enough, not through perfection, but through presence. In the final days of autumn, when light began to arrive at an angle that made even broken things glow, I finished the piece. It wasn't the sculpture I had first envisioned. In fact, it bore almost no resemblance to what I thought I had been building, yet it breathed. It breathed with the weight of silence and survival and things too soft to name, as though each fragment had chosen its place not by design, but by devotion that could not be explained. The glass was curved and cracked and fused with delicate lines of gold, not hidden, not masked, but revealed with intention, as if every fault had become a passage for light to enter and transform fracture into form. I called it inheritance, though not for what was passed down by blood, but for what endures when love is chosen again and again, in spite of the mess and memory it must carry. And when I stepped back to look at it, I did not see resolution. I saw rhythm, a kind of breathing made visible in light, in stillness, in the absence of need for explanation. The gallery was quiet the night of the opening, the way forests fall silent before snow begins its descent, cautious, weightless. People came, looked, murmured with voices low and thoughtful, moving like slow water. But when my family arrived, my father walking slow, Martha wrapped in her softest scarf, and Leo carrying coffee instead of flowers, I felt a stillness take root in the air around me, not heavy, but whole. They didn't speak as they stood before the piece, and I didn't offer explanation because none was needed. The glass held what words could not. My father touched the curve of a golden fracture with the back of his hand, his fingers trembling not from weakness, but from the memory embedded in the shape, in the shimmer, in the shared survival. Martha stepped closer, her eyes not wet but open, the way dawn looks when it finally decides to rise without apology. Leo stood slightly apart, but his presence was anchoring, a gravity without pressure, a tether without claim, for a moment. We weren't a family repaired. We were a family revealed, gathered not by necessity, but by quiet decision. Later, when the guests had thinned and the gallery emptied into the cool of evening, we remained in that quiet space of after. There was no speech, no toast, no summing up of chapters or wounds, only the sculpture, the light, the echo of soft footsteps, and the deep, shared breath of people who had learned that forgiveness is not a gate, but a garden that opens slowly. We stepped outside together, into a night that held no promises, but made room for return, for continuation. In my studio later that week, I placed the piece near the largest window, not as a centerpiece, but as a witness. Morning came, slow and pale, and caught the gold in the glass just so, casting long, fractured shadows that looked less like darkness and more like choreography, like a dance of what remained. I stood in it for a while, letting the lines fall across my arms, across my face, and I didn't move, not because I was frozen, but because I finally felt still, like water that had found its container. Some stories end with a revelation, others with a reckoning. Mine ends with a resonance, one that lives not in the answer, but in the act of asking, and listening to what lingers in the pause, and in that asking. I found a family, not one I could have drawn, but one I could stand with and stay with. And in the glow of a light that passed through every crack, I realized the glass was never meant to be whole. It was meant to hold light, and it does.